Okay, welcome back everybody. Nobody's here yet, but still, feel like I'm talking to myself really, going mad a bit. But today we're going to be doing distinguishing between participles and gerunds. And so if you want to see the source of these questions, you can find them on a wonderful website called Towson University. That's Towson. And if you type into Google Towson, gerunds, participles, exercise 1, I am sure you will find the same exercise that I am looking at. So I think that will be helpful for this class, because this class we're going to just look at participles and gerunds, and we're going to use Towson University that have 4 excellent exercises on this topic. Yeah. So Towson University, which have 4 excellent exercises, that would be better. So if we look at sentence number 1, sewing slowly and meticulously, comma, the tailor repaired the antique tapestry. Now, the first thing to notice is that the clause before the comma is very different from the clause after the comma. The clause after the comma is a main clause, which can stand on its own. The clause before the comma, sewing slowly and meticulously, certainly can't stand on its own. The second thing to notice is that the main clause after the comma has got the tailor, subject, repaired, verb, object, the antique tapestry. A nice simple sentence with subject, verb, object. That's why it's a main clause, because it's got subject, verb, object. If we look at the clause before the comma, it hasn't got anything like that. It's got sewing. I mean, the first question that you should ask yourself when you read this sentence, and I think you do, even if you don't realise that you do, the first thing your brain asks is, who or what was sewing slowly and meticulously? And the answer to that question must be the subject of the main clause, because in this sentence we are dealing with a participle. And how do I know that? Because participles are adjectives. They must describe a noun. And sewing here is not an activity, which would be a noun, a gerund. It's actually an adjective describing the tailor. It's describing what the tailor was doing. And so this is a participle clause in the first position. It's a participle clause because it doesn't have any kind of main verb in there, sewing slowly and meticulously. But it does have an ing word. I mean, remember, participles can be ed words as well if they're past participles, or even they can be irregular, like found or known, and then they would certainly look a little bit different. They wouldn't have ing on the end. But this participle clause is an obvious one because you can see the ing, and when you look at that word sewing, it is not the subject of a main verb. If it had been the subject of a main verb, it would be a gerund. So for example, sewing is fun. Sewing is the subject, is the copular verb, and fun is an adjective describing the sewing. And so that would be a gerund. Sewing is fun, that's a gerund. Sewing is a noun. But in this sentence, it's an adjective. It's not the subject of a verb. It's describing the tailor, and he is the subject of the main verb, repaired. So number 1 is definitely a participle, and you should recognize that, because if you read any literature, kids literature, adult literature, any kind of literature, you will find that participle clauses are used all the time, and they're very often used in the first position before the main clause. It's not the only way you can use them. You can use them after the main clause. You can use participles before nouns, you know, the running man, the man who was running, yeah? So they can be used like that as well. But in this sentence, it's being used with a participle clause describing the tailor. So number 1 is a participle, certainly. If we look at the next exercise, the next question, do you mind my mentioning this subject to my friends? First thing to notice is that they use my mentioning and not do you mind me mentioning. Now, that's the form that is very often spoken now. Do you mind me mentioning this subject to my friends? But it's a mistake. It should be my. and it should be my, because mentioning is the object of mind. Okay, it's the object of the main verb, which means it's a noun, which means it must be a gerund. And the idea here is that if you have a gerund, you really ought to use a possessive pronoun before it. My. Do you mind my mentioning this subject to my friends? You shouldn't have me, because me is an object pronoun, which means me, if we say, do you mind me, that makes me look like the object of the verb mind, and then mentioning is kind of like a participle describing the object. The truth is, if you say, do you mind me mentioning this subject to my friends, it makes the word mentioning half like a gerund and half like a participle, and so it's not acceptable. It should be, do you mind my mentioning this subject to my friends? Now, because mentioning is the object of the verb mind, it is a gerund in this sentence. It's being used as a gerund. And so you really ought to say, do you mind my mentioning this? Or do you mind his mentioning this? Not do you mind him mentioning this? It's got to be the possessive pronoun and not the subject, not the object pronoun. Okay? So any object of the verb, it will be a gerund. Come on to number 3. Buying too much fresh food all at once can increase chances of spoilage. Now, I've wrote a sentence very similar to this in my participles video, and I made a big mistake because it wasn't a participle and I was calling it a participle. If we look at the word buying here, it's actually the subject of the modal verb and the main verb can increase. Yet what can increase chances of spoilage? Buying blah 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 can increase chances of spoilage. So buying is definitely the subject of this sentence, and the subject of a sentence must be a noun, and the subject of the sentence therefore must be a gerund noun. It's buying too much fresh food all at once is a gerund phrase because it's the subject of can increase. Okay, so that's how I know buying too much fresh food all at once can increase chances of spoilage. Buying must be a gerund. It's the subject of can increase. Okay, and that's a good example of how you can have a very long phrase as the subject. It doesn't have to be one word. It could be buying too much fresh food all at once. All of that together can increase chances of spoilage. Okay, if we look at number 4, his heart's desire, proposing to Mary tomorrow night, was out of the question. Now, quite a few students make a mistake here, and they think proposing, it must be an adjective. It must be describing the heart's desire. However, it is not actually functioning like that in this sentence. What we are doing here is renaming the heart's desire. This is actually an appositive, which is where you rename something. Something like Theresa May, comma, the Prime Minister, comma. That would be an appositive. And here we have the same structure. We have his heart's desire, comma, proposing to Mary tomorrow night. Yeah, the heart's desire was proposing to Mary the next night. So because we're renaming it, we rename it with another noun. And it's the same with Theresa May, the Prime Minister. Theresa May is a noun, it's a thing, quite literally. And the Prime Minister is a noun, again, a thing, quite literally. So we rename with nouns, and that's why I know this one must be a gerund. Now, I'm going to prove it to you now, because if I put this, if you say it is a participle, okay, let's try putting the participle clause at the front and say, proposing to Mary tomorrow night, comma, and then put the main clause, his heart's desire was out of the question. Yeah, I'm trying to make it look like number 1, sewing slowly and meticulously, the tailor repaired the antique tapestry, because we said that was a participle, and it is. It's a participle clause and then the main clause. Well, let's try doing that here. Proposing to Mary tomorrow night, comma, his heart's desire was out of the question. That is an incorrect sentence. Why? Because when we have a participle clause at the front, the subject, the thing doing the sewing in number 1, the tailor, must come as the subject of the main clause. It must come right after the comma as the subject of the main clause. And if we do that with this sentence, proposing to Mary tomorrow night, comma, his heart's desire was out of the question, that means that his heart's desire was proposing to Mary, and that's not actually possible. His heart's desire was not, his heart's desire, what I mean is a heart's desire cannot propose marriage. A person can propose marriage, but a heart's desire cannot propose marriage. So technically, proposing to Mary tomorrow night, comma, his heart's desire, that's wrong. A heart's desire cannot propose to Mary tomorrow night. Only people can propose to Mary tomorrow night. So it's not functioning as a participle. It's not functioning as an adjective describing the heart's desire. It's renaming the heart's desire as a noun. And when you see appositives, they're going to be nouns. They're not going to be participles. They're not going to be adjectives. They're going to be nouns. They're going to be gerunds, because we're renaming a noun with another noun. So renaming is not the same as describing. That's the moral of this story. If we say proposing to Mary tomorrow night, we have to have the person who's going to propose afterwards. We can't have his heart's desire, because that's just another name. It's just another way of referring to the proposing to Mary tomorrow night. It's not the person who is doing it. It's not the agent. So that's why proposing is not a participle in number 4. It's a gerund. It's renaming the noun. Let's have a look at number 5. And if anyone can't find this exercise, I'll repeat, because I said it at the start and you might have come a bit later. Towson University. Type into Google now, TOWSON, gerund participle exercise 1. You will find the exercise we are on. It's a great website anyway, so there are many other exercises on gerunds and participles. So if we look at number 5, upon reaching the harbour, comma, the sailors debarked and streamed into town. Now again, you should notice that the second clause is the main clause here. The sailors, subject, debarked, verb, and streamed, verb, into town, the preposition and the object, yeah? Now, we know that's the main clause, which means the first clause, well, if we look at it, upon reaching the harbour, it's clearly subordinate, it's clearly unfinished. And then we look at the clause a little bit more closely, and we've got upon, which is a preposition. Okay, if you don't know what a gerund is, you'll really have to go and watch some of my other videos, because I'm not going to go into go back to the basics. This is quite advanced, the difference between participles and gerunds. So the object of the preposition upon, the object of any preposition must be a noun, which means the object of upon must be a noun, and that means it must be a gerund. Okay, so here, upon reaching the harbour, it's a gerund. Now, believe me, there's a very similar sentence I can give you where it's a participle. If I say having reached the harbour, comma, the sailors debarked and streamed into town, having reached is a participle there describing what the sailors had done. But if it's after a preposition, it's got to be a gerund, okay? And that's where they come very close. I mean, really, upon reaching the harbour, they streamed into town. Having reached the harbour, they streamed into town. You can see how gerunds and participles do get very, very similar to one another. But the object of a preposition must be a noun, so this one must be a gerund. Simple as that. Let's come on to number 6. Nobody likes that picture hanging in the den. So how is the word hanging functioning in this sentence? Is it the object of like? No. The object of like, well, the subject of likes is nobody, and the object of likes is the whole that clause. Nobody likes that picture hanging in the den. The whole of that is the object of like. The whole of that is what nobody likes. And if we look at the word hanging, hanging here is actually describing the picture. It's not functioning as a noun. It's describing the picture that nobody likes. It's describing where that picture is. So it's acting kind of like an adverbial phrase and saying where the picture is hanging. But here, hanging is describing the picture. And because it's describing the picture, it must be an adjective. So it must be a participle. And this is something to notice. Participles, very often you can look at this sentence as nobody likes that picture, which is hanging in the den. And when you can do that, it's a reduced relative clause. And when it's a reduced relative clause, it's always functioning as an adjective describing the noun. Okay, it's describing the picture. So it's got to be a participle here, not a gerund. Look at number 7. We rested for an hour after lugging 2 rooms of furniture to the dump. Lugging comes after the word after. After is a preposition, so lugging is the object of a preposition. Anytime a word is the object of the preposition, it must be a noun. It must be a gerund. So we rested for an hour after lugging. Lugging's got to be a gerund here. It's the object of after. Okay, if we go on to number 8, the people standing at the back of the auditorium. We could read that as the people who were standing at the back of the auditorium. Standing is describing the people, so it must be a participle. Yeah, it's a reduced relative clause and it's describing the people. It's got to be a participle. John, comma, having eaten the most hot dogs, comma, won the contest. Having eaten the most hot dogs is describing John, and so it's got to be a participle. We could change it round and say having eaten the most hot dogs, comma, John won the contest. It's clearly a participle clause describing John. Look at number 10. Harold's greatest joy in life is, and that's the most important word there, playing the tuba in the team band. So what we've got here is Harold's greatest joy in life, which is the subject of the verb to be, and then we've got the complement. Please remember that we can't call the word that comes after is or am or was or were, we can't call it the object of the verb. We've got to call it the complement of the verb, because it's not the object, it's not the thing which is being done to it, it's just describing the subject. Very often it's describing the subject. So here we've got, what we've got here is something which is telling us something more about the subject. And when we have this, we've actually got a gerund. It's actually a noun which is telling us which activity Harold's greatest joy in life is. It's telling us about the activity. It's not really describing the activity, it's just complementing the subject here. And so certainly it will be a gerund if we've got it either in the subject position before to be, or the object, not the object, or the complement position after to be. It's going to be a gerund, and it's going to be, giving us more information about Harold's greatest joy in life, which has got to be an activity. It's got to be a noun here. Okay, if we look at number 11, we've got the film showing. So this is the film, I would say, being shown usually, if it's still on, which is just another, being is an auxiliary verb there, making it passive. It's making a passive participle. But this is a participle because showing at the Ritz is describing the film. It's not an activity, it's not a noun, it's describing the film. Okay, with number 12, there is no harm in stating your opinion. So stating comes after a preposition, it's a gerund. Anything that comes after a preposition, it's the object of the preposition, it's a noun, it's a gerund. Number 13, after that long speech, notice you've got a preposition and an object, the speech, it's always followed by a noun. We all felt like taking a long nap. Now, like is a preposition. You might not know that, but it is a preposition. It's used informally as a conjunction, but that's technically not correct. Like is a preposition, which means you need to use a noun after like, which means here we've got another gerund. Yeah, like taking a long nap. It's what you felt like doing, so it's a noun, it's an activity. It's not describing a noun, it's just giving you the object of like. Number 14, the philanthropist enjoyed giving away lots of money. So we've got the object of the verb enjoyed. So it's got to be a noun, it's got to be a gerund. And number 15, you don't see children who are or who were swinging hula hoops around their waists. So this swinging hula hoops around their waists is clearly describing the noun, children. It's describing what they're doing. So this participle phrase modifies children. Okay, I hope that's clear. I hope that has cleared up some difficulties anyway. If you have any questions, please put them under the video. If you've got any now, right now, I can answer them in the next 10 seconds, but then I've got to go and teach a student. So put them up now. I'll give you a few more seconds, and then we're going to finish for sure. Okay, give you another blah, 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 and I hope to see you all soon.